Good morning, everyone. It's great to see you back for the second day of our Civics Academy. Hope you had a wonderful time last night, either going to the baseball game or perhaps walking around Market Square and seeing the Bill Lyons Pavilion, which we told you about. So before introducing our speaker, I do want to make a couple of requests of you. We'll mention this as well later today. But we are really looking to expand our work here in the Institute of American Civics to try and serve K through 12 education. So there's a couple of things that we would like you to be thinking about. Frankie might have mentioned some of these already to you. But one thing is that we want to provide more professional development opportunities for you in your districts. We've done this regularly for Knox County schools. We have a wonderful relationship. I know we have some Knox County teachers that have seen you at your professional development days. It's always just an honor to be with you. And we do know that sometimes that professional development for social studies, civics, history might not get as much attention from your districts. And so if there are opportunities where you have, say, a professional development day in your district, or you just like us to come in for one day and do a PD day, please let us know. We're delighted to come to you. Also, we're going to be working on increasing our on-campus programming for high school students. So if there are ideas that you have that you think would be beneficial for high school students that we could help implement here in Knoxville, please pass those along to us as well. So now, it's my privilege once again to introduce one of my colleagues at the Institute of American Civics, our Associate Director, Andy Busch. Andy, I'm still just always amazed that we're able to recruit him. He is an extremely distinguished political scientist, one of the leading students of the presidency in America today. I've lost track of the number of books that he's written. It's over 20, I believe, edited and written. He just had one come out last week on the 2024 presidential election called The Comeback. Andy also happens to be the author of the longest running series on presidential elections. He's been writing a book since 1992 on every presidential election. We were talking about this earlier. I think that's actually the longest running series on presidential elections in U.S. history. So he is regularly called on by outlets for his expertise. Just in this past presidential election, C-SPAN had him on twice for two specials, one on the 1948 presidential election, one on the 1980 presidential election. So prior to coming here to the Institute of American Civics, he first taught at the University of Denver in Colorado. Then he moved to Claremont McKenna College, where he was for about 20 years, served as professor and chair of the department there. And then somehow we were able to attract him here to East Tennessee. So please join me in welcoming Andy Busch.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Josh, and thank you all for being here. I know I've been teaching for about 33 years now, and I know how precious summer is, and to take some days out of your summer to come be part of this program, I think is really amazing, and a credit to everybody here. So thank you for all that you do for our students, and by way of what you do for our students, what you do for our state and our country. So I was asked to talk a little bit about the presidency today. The presidency, of course, is always in the news, these days perhaps more than ever. And the title, as you can see, is The President's Many Hats. That comes from a book that was written by a political scientist by the name of Clinton Rossiter in the early 1960s. So this is an old book that this phrase comes from, but I like it because he was reaching out to the storied political drama of Gilbert and Sullivan, right? In the HMS Pinafore. The admiral in the HMS Pinafore has all these hats that he has to kind of juggle. And Rossiter's argument was that there were about 10 roles, and I think this is still true. You'd have to update all the facts in his book, but the framework still holds. About half of these are what you might call constitutional roles. rules that are flowing directly from the Constitution or can be deduced pretty directly from its provisions. And these were all rules that were present from the beginning. They have changed, they've evolved over time, but they have always been there. The other rules, about the other half of the rules, are what you might call extra-constitutional rules. They go beyond the Constitution. They're not really envisioned by the Constitution in any explicit way, and possibly not even implicitly, though they do sometimes overlap with some of the constitutional rules. But they came into existence because of particular presidents who wanted to take this new role, and then it became solidified over time by other presidents following, and by the American people accepting these roles, sometimes embracing these roles. So they've become roles not by the Constitution, but by practice, and in at least one case, by statute. We'll talk about that in a minute. So if you look at the constitutional rules, there are only 5 of them. There's head of state, chief executive, commander-in-chief, chief diplomat, and chief legislator. Chief legislator, I think, may be a little bit of an exaggeration, but for some reason, Rossiter really liked the word chief, and so it shows up a lot. But the president clearly plays a major role in legislation. So what I want to do is take a look at each of those, draw a brief outline of what they're about, maybe some important moments in their development, and then show you some examples of presidents who have been particularly important in that role. So head of state. This is the person who's the role of being kind of the ceremonial head of the country. We would say, in a lot of ways, it's a monarchical role, akin to the role that the King of Britain plays today, or something like that. They get this role partly because they're the only official in the U.S. government, other than the vice president, who's elected by the whole country. But they have certain somewhat ceremonial roles, or at least roles that began as ceremonial in the Constitution, like receiving foreign ambassadors. And their position really in this role is to kind of represent the dignity of the whole country, right? To be sometimes people use the word figurehead. That might be understating a bit, but the person who kind of represents the whole country and holds it together in some way. This is a very important role. In fact, some of you may be familiar with Stephen Knott, who came to Memphis and did a program with us. He wrote a book called The Lost Soul of the American Presidency recently, in which he argued that this was really, in some ways, the most important role the president has. Certainly something that was anticipated from the beginning. Sometimes it involves symbolism that's very kind of lighthearted cultural symbolism. I'll show an example of that in a minute. Other times it's speaking to the country, holding the country together in some moment of grief, representing the whole country. So here's the first example, George Washington. This is a representation of Washington on his grand tour of the states. One of the things he did as president, early in his presidency, was to travel to as many states as he could, not for any substantive purpose, but just to be there and to say, I've been to all the states, or almost all the states. I'm attending to the whole country. That's what the president is here to do. Here's John F. Kennedy at the Army-Navy game. Now, I would not want to exaggerate too much how unifying this is, because he was pretty clearly rooting for Navy and not for Army. But there he is with an Army general. They're watching the game. He appeared. This is akin to presidents who sometimes throw out the first pitch at a baseball game, right? Or who open the Boy Scout Jamboree. or who, when they light the national Christmas tree, very nonpartisan, above partisanship, above politics, even more broadly conceived, kind of national symbol. Here's President Reagan, who I think was, in my lifetime, possibly the president who was most suited to this role. This is him at Normandy, giving the famous speech at Pont du Hoc to the veterans on the 40th anniversary of D-Day. And here's President George W. Busch at the National Cathedral just a few days after 9/11, binding up the nation's wounds, rallying the country in some way. At that moment, outside of politics, right, at least outside of partisan kind of small ball politics. So that's the chief executive. I'm sorry, the head of state, not the chief executive, the head of state. So the next one is the chief executive. The chief executive is not a symbolic role. It is a nuts and bolts, how do you run the executive branch of the government role? Basically in charge of taking care that the laws be faithfully executed, overseeing the federal bureaucracy that exists in order to do that. That's a very different role, and it takes a very different skill set. Today, we have 15 cabinet-level departments, dozens of agencies, bureaus, et cetera, about 3 million civilian employees, I think, roughly. And it's not easy for the president to wrangle this. About 97% of those federal employees are under civil service protection. So he can appoint the very top people. He can use that appointment power, but he can only use it down through about 3% of the federal workforce. Other folks in the federal bureaucracy can kind of sit back and say, well, I've been here through 6 presidents already. I don't have to pay attention to this guy. So that's a challenge for presidents. Also, the agencies and departments have sometimes conflicting missions. There's tension between them. Even within the same department, different branches of it have different missions, different cultures, and they're butting heads. For a while, I don't think this is true anymore, but for a significant period of time, the agriculture department was providing subsidies to tobacco farmers. Its mission was to advance farming. The Surgeon General, at the very same time, was trying to convince people not to smoke. His mission was public health, right? So the president has to navigate all of that and try to wrangle it in a way that is at least somewhat coherent. As a result, I have often told my students, the president does not run the country. You hear that term sometimes, the president's running the country. The president does not run the country. This is not North Korea. The president doesn't even really run the government. On a really good day, when everything is going his way, the president may possibly be able to run the executive branch. All right, so that's the chief executive. Now, something that I should note at this point is that if you look at the chief executive and the head of state, there are many countries, including most of the democracies in Europe, where those roles are separated. There are 2 different people. There's one, like the king, the queen, who's the head of state, and then there's someone else, a prime minister, or in Germany, the chancellor, who is filling the chief executive role for that government. So in the United States, those 2 are fused into one person. You see here the growth of this role. George Washington's cabinet, 3 cabinet secretaries and an attorney general who did not even have his own department. It was just the attorney general. Here is Donald Trump's 2025 cabinet, or some of them. That picture is actually cut off a little bit. You could, if you go online and look for it, you can see a very long table completely surrounded by people. The other thing to note about this is that in 1939, Congress created at the request of the president the executive office of the president, which is not cabinet officials. Those are all presidential appointees. You don't really have, at least in many of those positions, civil service folks, they're either in the White House or in the executive office building right across the street, very close proximity. And sometimes the president has used those folks as a kind of substitute for the permanent bureaucracy if he can't get what he wants in the permanent bureaucracy. When Richard Nixon made his approach to China, his visit to China, really path-breaking visit, it was arranged by the National Security Advisor, who was part of the now the executive office of the president, not by the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State was not very happy about that, by the way. All right, Commander-in-Chief, very important role, and I'm going to take a couple of minutes to dive into this a little bit more than I was originally going to because of events of the last week. So the president is the commander of all U.S. military forces. In wartime, he has the say over strategy, over commanders, things of that sort. He proposes to Congress what he, even in peacetime, what he thinks the structure of the armed forces should be. If you have ever been in the armed forces or even in ROTC at some point, you have to learn the chain of command. Who's at the top of the chain of command? The President of the United States, right? Now, we're going to get into the War Powers Resolution more in a minute. Short wars versus big and long wars, that does make a difference for the president. If you're talking about a short commitment of U.S. forces or one that is relatively small, one that is relatively uncostly, the president has a lot more free action there. The longer the war is, the longer it goes on, the more expensive it becomes in human or economic terms, the more Congress begins to exert a say, right? So there is a difference between those kind of engagements. Well, you can see, again, as with all of these constitutional rules, George Washington really laying down a marker here. This is George Washington getting ready to lead the federal troops on the way to dealing with the Whiskey Rebellion. He did not take the commander-in-chief power as a metaphor. Right? He got on his uniform and got on his horse and led the troops into western Pennsylvania. By the time they got there, the rebellion had kind of dissipated. But he took that role very literally and very seriously. President Lincoln did not lead the federal troops into the Battle of Gettysburg or something like that, but he was a very active commander-in-chief as well. And this, in his case, took the form of working really hard to find generals who would actually prosecute the war in the way that he thought was necessary. So these guys are the commanders of the Army of the Potomac, the federal army in the eastern theater of the war. And basically, all of them except for Grant at the end got fired by Lincoln and replaced by the next one because they weren't doing what he thought needed to be done. The first one, George McClellan, was very timid, very cautious. He finally was ousted. Ambrose Burnside lost the battle at Fredericksburg, partly because he was too slow in exploiting an opportunity that was there. He got sacked. He also gave to his basic contribution was defeat at Fredericksburg and the term sideburns. And you can see why. Joseph Hooker is the next one in line, lost the Battle of Chancellorsville on another failed drive to Richmond. Also, too cautious, too slow. It was a brilliant plan, very badly executed. And he gave us really nothing except the defeat at Chancellorsville and another term, which I won't get into too much, but it had to do with camp followers who were kind of following around. So General Hooker was gone, and on came General Meade, who was the victorious general at Gettysburg, but then didn't really follow up the way that Lincoln thought he should. And finally, you wind up with Ulysses S. Grant. So Lincoln was not at all hesitant about dumping his generals and moving on to another possibility until he finally found one who did what he thought needed to be done. McClellan, by the way, you probably know this, ran against Lincoln after having been sacked as the Democratic nominee for president in 1864. And for many months of that campaign, a lot of people, including Lincoln, thought that McClellan was going to win, but that did not happen. You see George W. Bush somewhat following in George Washington's footsteps in a very general way, donning the uniform, flying a plane onto the aircraft carrier. I included the ill-fated mission accomplished banner up there, probably an unwise move on the president's part. But he obviously took his role as commander-in-chief very seriously, as do all contemporary presidents and modern presidents. Fourth, chief diplomat. Oh, wait, I was going to tell you more about the commander-in-chief. This all happened, the bombing of Iran all happened after I had done my slides and sent them off for processing and all of that. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the commander-in-chief power and particularly the war power. And you hear the debate now. It's a very live debate. Should the president have gone to Congress before the bombing of Iran? Should he have gotten the permission of Congress? Well, this is a complicated question, actually. And the first thing that I would urge you to do, not just in this case, but in any similar case, is to set aside whatever sort of feelings you have about the president, pro or con, this president or future presidents who get in situations like this, and think more institutionally about it, because I think there's a tendency of people who like President Trump to say, well, yes, of course, he did the right thing and he should not have gone to Congress, he didn't need to do that. And people who don't like President Trump saying, just because they don't like President Trump, no, he was acting unconstitutionally. And then when the parties change, the arguments flip 180 degrees. And that's not the way that any of us should be thinking about this. So it's a complicated issue because there's a constitutional element, there's a statutory element, and there's a political element to this question. Should the president have gone to Congress? The constitutional layout, as you know, is that the president is the commander-in-chief, and Congress is responsible for declaring war, for raising an army and a navy, and also, you could say indirectly related to this, appropriating money, right? It has the power of the purse. Now, there's, unfortunately for our case, and for all cases like this, there is ambiguity over time about what these constitutional, what the constitutional requirement is exactly, and what it means for the Congress to declare war. Does that mean that presidents have to get permission from Congress every time they use the military? That has not been the practice, right? There have only been 5 declared wars in the history of the United States. I always ask my students if they know which 5. Usually they come close, but they forget the Spanish-American War or something like that. But it was the War of 1812, War with Mexico, Spanish-American War, World War I, and World War II. There have, needless to say, been many, many military actions, including some very large ones, Korea, Vietnam, the 2 wars with Iraq, war in Afghanistan, that were not subject to a declaration of war by Congress formally, and then lots of smaller actions as well. So is the declaration of war a permission by Congress to use military force, or is it just a recognition that a state of war exists? This was a big debate in the Mexican War. President Polk had put the army in a disputed territory. The Mexican army fired first. They actually initiated combat. But there was a debate in Congress over whether, what a declaration of war even meant. The president had not asked for permission to put forces in a potentially provocative spot. And the war had already started. So was this declaration really just a formal acknowledgement that war was already underway, or what exactly was it? I think the best understanding, if you think constitutionally about the spirit of the Constitution, is that Congress should be consulted before major military actions. And that would depend on sort of the anticipated duration, the anticipated size of the action, and so on. Does the action in Iraq qualify? Very good question. It certainly, at this point, falls within a lot of the military actions that have been taken in the past without a declaration of war. But we don't know the future, right? We don't know actually what this is going to lead to. Things have calmed down a bit, at least as of last night. I didn't look at the news this morning, so who knows what happened this morning. But there was a concern by some that perhaps this could lead into a more extended period of hostilities. But it's ambiguous at this point. There are some who would argue that the greatest power that the Congress has in war is appropriation, not the power to declare war. But that's also hard to exercise once hostilities have begun. Well, what about the statutory end of this? The main statute that is at issue is the War Powers Resolution, passed in 1973 over the veto of President Nixon. He vetoed it because he saw it as too restrictive on his commander-in-chief power. There were others who criticized and have ever since criticized the War Powers Resolution as being too unrestrictive, that in their view it gave the president too much of a blank check. So how does it work? What are the key requirements? Well, the first one is not quite a requirement, but a request, you could say, a recommendation, that the president consult with Congress in advance if it is practical. Right? Now, what constitutes practical, given needs for operational security and things like that, is up for debate. The president absolutely has to notify Congress within 48 hours of after the beginning of the military action. And then the president can basically have a free hand for up to 60 days if Congress has not passed either a declaration of war or some kind of resolution approving, authorizing the action by the end of the 60 days, then the president has to end the action unless he can certify that ending it abruptly would put into danger the forces that are committed, in which case he has an additional 30 days. So there's a 60 to 90 day window for the president to act. On the other hand, if Congress in the middle of this decides that this is just a really bad idea, they can actually also pass a resolution positively requiring the president to remove troops. So where does this stand in relation to Iran? Well, there was no consultation in advance. In fact, there were large parts of the executive branch that didn't even know about this because it was considered a highly secret mission. So hence, from the president's viewpoint, not not practical to go to Congress with this in advance. They have, obviously they're aware. It was not kept secret after the fact, so the notification, you could say, has been met, at least informally. And Congress has passed no resolution requiring that the actions stop. The action's not even ongoing at the moment. And the 60-day window is far from expiring. So I think that the reasonable conclusion would be whether it was a wise action or not. That's a totally separate issue. But I think from a statutory standpoint, so far, I would argue that President Trump is in compliance with the War Powers Resolution. Now, the added complication to this is that every president, except for Obama, has basically refused to acknowledge that the War Powers Resolution is binding on them, both because they think it interferes with their explicit powers as commander-in-chief, and because of a Supreme Court decision in 1983 called Chatta v. INS, in which Congress had used a mechanism called a legislative veto, where they had given the president some grant of discretion on the condition that Congress could then come back and nullify his actions later by a resolution that the president could not veto. And the Supreme Court threw that out. It was not the War Powers Resolution, it was a different piece of legislation, but they threw out the legislative veto and considered it unconstitutional because it lacked the, it lacked the ability of the president to sign or veto the resolution. There's a real question about whether it's even constitutional. Mike Johnson raised that issue again yesterday. The political question then is also present. Generally speaking, presidents would benefit from having congressional support. It gives them more solid ground. But on the other hand, it's a little risky to go to Congress, because what if you ask them and they say no? Do you do it anyway? George H.W. Bush, before the first Iraq War, basically said he would. He said, I don't need this vote, but I'm going to ask for it anyway. That would not put a president in a good political situation. From the standpoint of Congress, unfortunately, I think it's unfortunate, Congress is not all that interested, and this is true of Republican and Democratic Congresses alike, they're not all that interested in taking responsibility for military actions. And so they're frequently more than happy for the president to take the whole burden of that, or to pass a resolution like they did before the Iraq War that says, if the president is authorized to use military force, if in his judgment it makes sense. Right? That's, that way, if the war goes well, they can claim credit, and if it doesn't, they can always say, well, we gave the president the option to go to war, but only if he used good judgment, and we don't think he really used good judgment. Right? So where does this put Iran, the fighting in Iran, I think in a very complicated space, which is why I think a lot of people naturally revert to their sort of partisan preferences on that. All right, well, we need to move along, but I wanted to say a little bit more about Commander-in-Chief. Let me go back. Chief diplomat, president appoints ambassadors, negotiates and submits treaties, receives foreign ambassadors. The United States versus Curtis Wright decision, I think, went too far, but it's an important decision, and what it said is that the president is the sole organ of the United States in foreign affairs. Presidents have taken that decision and run with it. The Senate can check the president. It can refuse to accept his nominees. It can decline to ratify a treaty. So it can check him in that way, but it cannot compel him to do things he doesn't want to do. So the president has a lot of leeway there. And you can see this going back to the beginning. The Jay Treaty, George Washington and his ambassador, John Jay, negotiated this with Britain in 17 94. You see personal diplomacy. Ronald Reagan with multiple summit meetings with Mikhail Gorbachev. Barack Obama opening up relations with Cuba. President Trump very recently in a kind of fiery exchange in the White House with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, and then a sort of make-up session at the Vatican during the funeral of the Pope, where they met together and apparently had a much better conversation. Finally, chief legislator. As I said, maybe a bit of an exaggeration, but there's definitely a constitutional grounding. The president can influence legislation up front by recommending measures. He can veto legislation at the back end. And they're now expected to propose big legislative programs. If a president ever came into office and just said, my role is to execute the law, to be the chief executive, commander-in-chief, but I'm going to let Congress do what it wants to do, I'm not going to interfere with the legislative process, people would think that was strange today, right? And as a result of this, we have this kind of first 100 days standard. What has the president accomplished with Congress in the first 100 days? That goes back to Franklin Roosevelt's time. And it's, I try to keep my own personal opinions out of this as much as possible, but it's kind of an absurd standard to hold any president to who is not in the middle of the worst depression in American history, right? So there was a crisis atmosphere that lubricated action, you could say. And unless you have that, you really can't expect to match Roosevelt's legislative accomplishments. But you can see here Franklin Roosevelt signing the Emergency Banking Act. You can see Lyndon Johnson going to Congress, arguing on behalf of the Civil Rights Act, and President Reagan signing his economic legislation in August of 1981 at his ranch in the signing ceremony. There have been ups and downs for the use of the veto. The veto is a very powerful tool. George Washington only used it twice. He did use it, though, but he only used it twice. Andrew Jackson got into great political controversy by using it 12 times and using it for things that were policy disagreements and not just what he considered to be constitutional problems with the legislation. By the time you get to the 1880s and 1890s, Grover Cleveland, over his 2 non-consecutive terms, cast 584 vetoes, of which only 7 were overridden. Franklin Roosevelt broke that record with 635 vetoes. By the time you get to George W. Bush, you're back to 12 vetoes, right? A very interesting development. Presidents have learned how to threaten a veto, and Congress doesn't want to waste their time, so the bill never even gets to the president's desk. Or, in a lot of cases, when the president's party is in control of Congress, they coordinate a lot more. President Roosevelt's party was in power the whole time. 635 vetoes of legislation passed by a Democratic Congress. It was said that at one point he even said something like, to Sam Rayburn, send me things to veto, because he liked sort of developing this idea that the president was the president of the whole people, the Congress has this different role, different institutions, they're not always going to see eye to eye, and a lot of that has gone by the wayside. So you see these key presidents. Now the extra constitutional roles. These developed slowly, gradually over time. Party leader, voice of the people, protector of the peace, world leader, manager of prosperity. Party leader is the oldest one of these. It goes back to Thomas Jefferson. Washington and Adams, first Adams, didn't like parties at all. Parties were there, but they didn't interfere with them very much or involve themselves. They certainly didn't embrace them. Jefferson embraced party, and he worked as a very important party strategist behind the scenes. And that was kind of the first task. But presidents, of course, now are considered as kind of a spokesman for their party, figurehead of the party, a fundraiser, very important fundraiser for their party, and a recruiter for candidates for their parties, for other offices. You can see Jefferson. Martin Van Buren was also important, partly as Jackson's second vice president, but then president in his own right. He was the one who really came up with the theory and pushed it hard that two-party competition should be a permanent thing and that it was a good thing for the country. Before that, there were two parties most of the time, but there was never a sense that this was a long-term, let alone a beneficial state of affairs. Van Buren made the argument for two-party competition. You see Ronald Reagan and Senator Howard Baker, when Baker was Senate Majority Leader, hashing out party strategy in the White House, and you see President Obama at a Democratic fundraiser in Chicago. Voice of the people. This one came a bit later. You could say Andrew Jackson kind of started this notion, but it really took off much more under Woodrow Wilson and before that Theodore Roosevelt. Rossiter says, since Jackson, no effective president has doubted his prerogative to speak the people's mind on the great issues of his time. This, I should point out, is in some tension, this role is, with the desire of the founders to limit what they call the popular arts that they said could mislead as well as dazzle. You see here Teddy Roosevelt traveling around by train to give speeches directly to the people to try to drum up support for his railroad regulation. You see Woodrow Wilson speaking at the State of the Union address to Congress in 1913. He was the first president since John Adams to give the speech in person, from Thomas Jefferson all the way up through Theodore Roosevelt. Presidents sent a written report because the Constitution does not require a speech. It just says the president shall report from time to time on the State of the Union to Congress. Woodrow Wilson brought back the speech and used it as a means of promoting his agenda. So you can see this role overlapping with the legislative leader role. And then Franklin Roosevelt giving one of his famed fireside chats. Protector of the peace. Presidents are now held accountable for breakdown of order and for effective response to acts of God. This could be riots, it could be crime, it could be hurricanes or other natural disasters, floods, labor strikes. It really started with presidential responses to labor strikes in the late 1800s. And of course, it has gone on from there. I would suggest that most of the time this is a no-win role for the president. Because if they do it well, people take it for granted. And if they don't do it well, they pay a heavy political price. So here are some examples. These are federal troops being called out by Grover Cleveland to deal with the Pullman strike in the 1890s. You have George W. Bush walking the devastated streets of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, which really hurt him, not walking the streets, but the federal response really hurt him politically. And of course, ripped from recent headlines, the riots in Los Angeles, which President Trump dealt with in a way that was very controversial, not really supported by the governing folks in California. World leader is a role developed as the United States became more powerful, more respected, a weight in the world that needed to be taken account of. Rossiter called the president of the West. Sometimes the president during the Cold War was called the leader of the free world, builder of international coalitions of all sorts, whether you're talking about fighting Iraq or trying to coordinate aid to Ukraine. Under the Biden administration, presidents have taken this role. And you see Teddy Roosevelt mediating an end to the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. He won a Nobel Prize for that. I would argue that this is really where this role begins. You see Woodrow Wilson walking with other world leaders at the Versailles Conference. And you see presidents during the Cold War taking our stance in Berlin as a kind of sign of world leadership. President Kennedy speaking to a crowd in Berlin in 1963, President Reagan speaking to a crowd in Berlin in front of the Brandenburg Gate in 1987. Finally, manager of prosperity. Rossiter says the people now expect their government under the direct leadership of the president to prevent a depression or panic, and not simply to wait until one has developed, to put it to route. Key moments: Great Depression and the Employment Act of 1946, the one statute that actually plays into this clearly. I put Herbert Hoover up here, not because I wanted to point him out as a counterpoint to this tendency, but really as the start of this tendency in a way. It is often underappreciated that Hoover took a more active role to trying to fight the Depression than any previous president had done. Launched a major public works program and many other things. Franklin Roosevelt took a lot of those things in the first New Deal and kind of put them on steroids, but it was not all that different in substance from what Hoover had been trying to do in many respects. You see the National Recovery Administration in the New Deal, and you see Harry Truman, the president, when the Employment Act was signed. The Employment Act of 1946 is important because it gave the president a statutory responsibility to maintain high employment and stable prices to the extent possible. All right, so those are the roles. I just want to make a few comments at the very end to wrap this together and then take questions. So the first point I would make is that this is obviously a very long list, and presidents have to prioritize. The public also prioritizes. If presidents prioritize this list in a different way than the public is prioritizing it, they can get into trouble. But no president can ever just say, I'm not doing some of this, right? So at the very same time President Trump is commander-in-chief ordering bombing in Iran, he's also still trying to get the big, beautiful bill through Congress, right, doing the legislative leader role. Lots on the president's plate. Second, the extra constitutional rules can be as important as the constitutional ones, but they are less defined. And because they're not really defined in the Constitution, they're also harder to check if you think that a president is going awry. Really, the main check is public opinion and elections when it comes to the extra constitutional rules. Third, there can be tensions among these roles. The head of state, the unifying figure, is not a role that is easily compatible with the party leader, where you're trying to just kind of advantage your party. The party leader can either help your role as legislative leader if your party is the majority, or it can hinder it if your party's the minority in Congress. Right? So there are tensions between these. Finally, this set of roles makes it actually difficult, challenging to evaluate presidents, because hardly any president is ever good at all of these things. And so when you're evaluating them, you have a tricky job. President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, was very good at getting his legislative program through Congress. Legislative leader role was highly successful. At the same time, he was commander-in-chief in Vietnam, not as successful. How do you weigh those things? President Reagan, I did argue, is an excellent head of state, diplomatic leader, world leader in a lot of ways, and voice of the people. But at the same time, as chief executive, kind of uneven, because he didn't always have the attention to detail that you would need to have. President Trump is an unfinished book, so it's a little hard to say. But if you take his first term, fairly successful as commander-in-chief. not all that successful as a legislative leader after its first year, and probably not someone who you'd put at the top of your list as unifying figures as head of state, right? So how do you evaluate all of that? It makes it difficult. So I'm just going to leave it with that and see what sort of questions you all have. Over there.
I think you did a great job of explaining how tricky it is to try to evaluate presidents. In your opinion, who do you think juggled the roles the best?
Well, I would say it's hard to give you a historical answer to that because some of the roles haven't existed the whole time, right? So I would kind of have to limit myself to the more modern presidents, I think. I would say that Franklin Roosevelt did a good job of balancing the roles, meeting most of the roles. I would say President Reagan did. I gave you a list of numerous areas where he succeeded, maybe one, not as much. I think I would say those two probably. I think President Obama in some ways. I mean, these are judgments I want to make clear that are not related to the content of their policies. Right, so you can say Franklin Roosevelt did a good job juggling these things and Ronald Reagan did a good job juggling these things, even though they had very different notions of what good policy was. And I think Obama did a reasonable job of balancing many of these tasks. And I don't think it's a coincidence that these are three of the multi-term presidents that we've had in recent years.
What would you say about Lincoln?
Well, Lincoln, yeah, I mean, Lincoln is very hard because on the one hand, it's kind of hard to argue that he did a great job as a unifying figure when the Civil War started because he was elected. It didn't end until he was assassinated. But I think right before, I think that Lincoln was masterful in taking what he had and leading the public, but also understanding the limits of what the public would bear. He was quite good as a party leader. He was, as commander-in-chief. I think he did what he needed to do. Right? There are other presidents who would have been more timid about making those command changes, and the war could have ended very differently. But I also think that shows that depending on the circumstance, you do weigh some things more than others, right? In his case, you have to weigh his commander-in-chief skills above some of the others.
My question is about the War Powers Act. Mm-hmm. Because we don't do boots on the ground anymore and like an airstrike, can you say it happened in 160 days and then a new 60 days starts with something else? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's very unclear. It's very unclear. The War Powers Resolution has really not been, it's been activated sort of forced by Congress, congressional discussions with the president on only a handful of occasions. Lebanon, for example, when President Reagan put troops into Lebanon briefly, the first time they came out, he reached an agreement with Congress, but that wasn't airstrikes either. Airstrikes present a really interesting situation, and in fact, I mentioned President Obama had sort of recognized the War Powers Resolution, but in a backhand way that I don't think anyone who wrote it would have accepted, and that is that unlike the other presidents, he said, yes, the president is bound by it, but no, it doesn't apply when I am bombing Libya because there have been no U.S. casualties, and therefore it doesn't count as combat. right? So mostly, I think its effect today is that Congress can try to use it as a bludgeon to sort of force the president into discussion with them.
I had a question actually about first ladies and how they play into these roles. So if you look at somebody like Eleanor Roosevelt and how much she perhaps helped FDR accomplish some of these roles, particularly maybe head of state.
Yes. So head of state is a really important one for first ladies because, first of all, they don't really want to be perceived as partisan. And that is the most sort of unpartisan or anti-partisan role out of all of them. And also because it involves a lot of ceremonial duties. And so first ladies are always involved in state dinners when there are new ambassadors or other state functions. They're right out there with the president lighting the Christmas tree and things like that. So that's important. Sometimes they also play an important kind of advisory role for the president behind the scenes, or they will work with relevant members of Congress. Sometimes they have actually, not all that often, but sometimes they have played a kind of, role in the president's legislative leadership behind the scenes. Hillary Clinton was unique in the sense that she was given purview over the healthcare plan that President Clinton proposed and headed that task force. So she played an important legislative role, but it was very open, and that actually was controversial because some people criticized it and said, well, we didn't elect her to do that. She's not an elected official. But she did play an important role in that.
First, I want to say thank you for sharing all of this great information with us and your expertise. My question is, in your eyes, what is the greatest misconception about these roles of the president that plays out in the public that we should maybe be seeking to undo with our practice?
Yeah, so I think the greatest misperception that people have has to do with the manager of prosperity role. And I say that because people have taken to thinking that the president has a kind of magic lever that, if the economy is bad, it's because the president did something automatically. If it's good, it's because the president did something good. And presidents, of course, can affect the economy. They do affect the economy, and sometimes quite dramatically. But they don't have any magic lever. Otherwise, we would never have a recession. Right? I mean, what president would ever allow there to be a recession if he could just, push a button and create prosperity? And the Employment Act, which gave the president those kind of economic responsibilities by statute, didn't really give the president a whole lot of additional tools. It did create the Council of Economic Advisors, but that's not really a tool of pushing the economy in any sort of direct way. Presidents can propose budgets, but Congress doesn't have to pass them. Presidents can try to reduce or increase levels of regulation, but that has to work through executive agencies and also commissions that the president can't actually fire the heads of in some cases. So you run into the permanent bureaucracy doing its thing. Presidents can appoint the head of the Federal Reserve Board. That's going to be an issue coming up soon. But once that person is on, they can't fire them. And the Federal Reserve Board does what it wants to do. It is designed to be independent. So the presidents do have a limited toolkit, you could say. And I don't think that many Americans understand that. And presidents have done this to themselves, right? Because they run for office saying, well, when I'm president, I'm going to fix this or that. And this president was terrible because he allowed X, Y, or Z to happen in the economy. And that sets them up, right? That sets themselves up for a lot of blame later on if things don't go well.
Yes, I wanted to ask you a really good question, but our time is running short, so you may not be able to answer it. But what about the rise of executive orders in our current political climate? Thank you.
All right, so I will try to give a quick answer to that, and then we'll be done. So executive orders have been around since George Washington, and there's a proper way to understand them and then a kind of an abuse of them. Right? The proper way to understand them is that they are orders given by the president under his chief executive role, his role to see to it that the law be faithfully executed. They're orders that he gives to the executive branch to give instruction about how they should understand and how they should apply and enforce laws that Congress has passed, or sometimes his own constitutional authorities, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, and that's been going on forever. The abuse of them, in my view, comes when presidents begin to try to use them as kind of substitute legislation. That is to say, they're not sometimes interpreting and applying the law. They're trying to create the law. And that has happened. President Biden did it. President Trump is doing it, I think. President Obama did it. This is not a partisan observation. All right, presidents have just done this more and more, and that's why a lot of executive orders go to court and they wind up getting thrown out, because the court says, well, the president can issue an executive order, but not on this, because this is beyond his actual authority. Okay, well, thank you all very much.